Good evening to everyone and welcome. We appreciate everybody being here tonight in person and also on online virtually. I am Phil Centonze. I'm the program chair for section 1510, as most of you already know, here in Southeast Florida. I would like now to introduce Kara Brien, who's the chair of section 1510. I'm going to introduce her now, if she wouldn't mind saying a few words as the chair. She's also the co-presenter on this presentation, which we'll get into in just a few minutes. But Kara, are you there? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Phil. How are you?
I'm great. You're coming in loud and clear.
Perfect.
So,
My name's Kara Brien. I'm the chair of ASQ 1510. Sorry, I couldn't be there tonight. I had a flight delay. Very happy to talk about Sterling and what it means to me. It's been lovely being an examiner and just seeing how much improvement it can do to organizations just so quickly. We'll be getting into that.
Okay, thanks, Kara. But I will introduce Kara as a co-presenter and talk a little bit about her. You know, the two of us put together the presentation. Kara has been a Sterling examiner. You're in your third year now, I believe, Kara. Is that correct?
My third year. And also, I'm about 8 years now removed from the NSU PI program. So, hello, my fellow sharks.
Okay, so Kara's the founder of her own independent consulting company, Lean Elevation, which is a process improvement company, and she helps businesses understand the current state, utilizes Lean Six Sigma and agile project management methodologies to facilitate continuous improvement projects. She's holds an MBA in process improvement from Nova, and you just heard her talking about, and she's a Six Sigma black belt, ASQ Six Sigma black belt, and as I mentioned, she serves as chair of section 1510. Let's see. When not working, Kara actively participates in Keep America Beautiful and Feeding America, helping clean up and feed her local community. Congratulations, Kara, for that. Thank you. And as I said, I'm Phil Centonze. I have a few more years experience than Kara has in Sterling. I'm actually a lead judge for the Governor Sterling Award and the Georgia Oglethorpe Award, which are equivalent. The Sterling Council, just for your information, used to be called the Florida Sterling Council until just a few years ago when Georgia's program started to go down the tubes. They were going to dissolve it, so they asked Florida to come in and take over the Georgia region as well. And so Sterling Council did that. That's why it's called the Sterling Council now, not the Florida Sterling Council. And anyway, so there's the Governor Sterling Award is for Florida organizations, and the Oglethorpe is for Georgia organizations. And when you talk about, there was a question about industries. What industries? They apply that the framework that we're going to talk about applies across all industries, whether it's not for profit, whether it's government, healthcare, education, manufacturing, other for-profit businesses, service, you name it. Any organization just about can apply for the high-level awards. Now there are a lot of others that I'm going to get into. Other levels of assessment and that is possible within the Sterling Council. Within Georgia and Florida. And then I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Okay, so what we want to do is introduce the Sterling framework and for performance excellence and talk about its use and assessment. This is the Sterling Resource Guide, and I've got a bunch of them here. Not enough for everyone, but if you want one, you can take one. They're in this bag. Or you can get the electronic version. For those of you online, you should have received the email with a link to be able to download the resource guide online. You can do that. You can use this QR code, or that's the website at the bottom there. So whatever you want to do, if you want to grab one of those later, that's fine. You don't need it during the presentation. I'm not going to talk about things that you have to look at. Anything that I talk about on the screen, I'll refer to the guide, and you can take a look at it later. All right, so this is just a sample of many award recipients that there have been. And I think I skipped the slide there, but I'll do this anyway first. So you can see on the Baldrige side, there's quite a number of organizations across industries that have been involved in Baldrige and have actually won, are recipients of the award. And the same thing on the Sterling side. You can see a number of organizations. And we're talking over the years now, it's been more than 30 years of both of these programs. We're probably talking I don't know, you can see the whole list online. 70, 80, 90 companies that have been recipients over time. And I just want to point out one here. You see City of Coral Springs is on both sides of that. It was a winner twice of Sterling, and the Sterling Award, and then applied for Baldrige, got involved in was the in fact they won the first year that the Baldrige had opened up the competition to not-for-profit, and government organizations. So City of Coral Springs is a standout for that. Baldrige was begun back in '87, as you can see there, and was a nationwide organization. It was intended. It was run by the inside the Department of Commerce by NIST. You may have heard of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and so Baldrige is operated out of there. It's intended to improve performance of American companies, and it provides recognition. And I say that, you see it's basically the same list on the Sterling side. Sterling was established in 1992. It was regional. It was Florida at the time, as I mentioned before, and is now regional Florida and Georgia. The mission is to elevate performance excellence, provides recognition, especially at the higher level, the Governor Sterling Award, and the Oglethorpe Award. But it's developmental, and where Baldrige is not. Baldrige is strictly an award process, whereas the Sterling has multiple levels of assessment, where companies and people as examiners can work to improve their professional expertise in organizational behavior and organizational performance and so on, and so it's very developmental. In fact, if you want to apply for the Baldrige, what they used to say, the Baldrige people used to say is, no, you can't apply until you go through your local program. And in the United States, there's something called the Baldrige Alliance, which is comprised of about 38, I think it is, or 39 programs like Sterling across the country. But again, very developmental for the organizations that are involved and the employees that are involved. So this is the framework. This is the framework for performance excellence. And as you can see, I've got a reference here. It's on page 13 of the Resource Guide. You'll look at more details, a lot more writing about it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it now as soon as we switch to the next slide. Okay, so at the top of that framework, you see the organizational profile. The organizational profile is different for every organization, right? I mean, it asks about, how is the company affected by regulation? Who are the customers? What are the customer requirements? What's its distribution system? How does it get product out or services out to its customers? How many employees are there within the organization? And so you can imagine, even companies that are identical in every way, except perhaps in numbers of employees, they're different. So no two companies are going to have the same organizational profile, but it's important because the organizational profile, from a company standpoint, describes the context that the company operates in. Like I said, all those things: regulation, competition. What are the challenges that it faces strategically? What advantages does it have strategically, and so on. It really describes what's important to that organization. And something that comes out of that, when as an examiner, you would pull out what we call key factors, but they all come from the organizational profile. They tell us what's important to that company. The dark blue boxes that you see in the profile are the criteria. There are 7 categories of criteria. You got on the left there, you see the triad, leadership triad. There are three categories. You have leadership, you've got strategy, and you have customers. And the triad is really the driver of the organization because at a high level, we're talking about leadership, understanding what customers require, what customers expect, and what customers need, and leadership develops, again, that high-level strategy for how are we going to operate as a business in order to accomplish what the customers need and what they're really after. On the other side, you see workforce, operations, and results. Well, workforce and operations are the way that the strategy is executed, right? You need people and you need processes. And so that's how you execute what it is, the strategy that was developed on the left side of that diagram. And of course, results tell us whether it worked. You know, are we doing what we intended to do with our strategy, what we intended to do to meet our customer needs, and are we achieving the results through our people and our processes in order to accomplish all of that? And there's box at the bottom which says measurement, measurement, analysis, and knowledge management. It's really it's a data and fact basis for an organization. It's important to be able to use data to figure out, did we do what we were supposed to do, or have we accomplished what we're supposed to accomplish, and what have we learned in how we've gone ahead and working through our operations. Did we learn, and how about everything that we've learned, all that knowledge that we've learned, has that been embedded in our company, in our organizations, embedded so that as people come and go, that the knowledge stays behind, so that the next person coming in can start with, instead of at ground zero, they start with a leg up, and they can continue to keep us successful as we go. I'm going to talk about the center first. The center word says integration. And what integration means is that, to me, very simply, is everything that happens in an organization affects everything else that happens within an organization, right? You've got to be not just aligned, but fully integrated. And an example I like to use when I talk about integration is if I'm a company, an organization, I have trouble hiring adequate talent, right? Some of you probably heard that problem out there in the real world recently, over the past few years. And so that's a challenge. So what am I going to do about that? Am I going to say, well, throw my hands up and say, and I'll use Indeed or something like that, try to find the people I need? Or am I going to say, okay, that means that I've got to do something with my own training, internal training program, to be able to bring people up who have fewer skills coming in, but keep them and retain them internally. To retain them, that means I've got to do something about having engagement processes for our employees. I've got to have, even the hiring and recruiting process. I've got to make sure that that's integrated and tied in with all the other things that we're doing. So that's kind of what integration means, that harmony of plans, harmony of processes within an organization, so that everything is working in the same direction. And then at the bottom, the true foundation of this model is the core values and concepts. And those are characteristics and behaviors of what high-performing organizations, they're the behaviors of a high-performing organization. And the criteria, the blue boxes, the criteria are really a means to determine how well embedded are those core values. So when a company is being evaluated, what the criteria are really doing is saying, okay, so if we got a core value of visionary leadership, all right, the criteria ask about leadership, they ask about communication, the criteria ask about how they engage not just their customers, and not just their employees, but all their stakeholders. How do they communicate with all of them, and so on. So, you get that foundation looking for those high-performing behaviors, the core values. So, I've been saying high performance a few times. What do you think? What's your definition of high performance? What does high performance mean to you? Anybody, online or here in the room? What does high performance mean?
Ability to execute.
Ability to execute, okay. What else? Being profitable, that's part of a result, right? Yes, Kim?
Efficiency.
Efficiency, okay. And what was it? Consistency. Okay. All those things are part of being high performing. And there are a lot more words in here, but this is really part of the definition of high performing is longer than that. But you can see it's being better, faster, more efficient than competitors, or than anybody, than other companies, achieving exceptional results. Part of results, having a focused, a collaborative commitment, and being communicative, and having the ability to have trust within your own organization, within your workforce. So that's what high performance is. And if we think about this, can anybody think of an example? It doesn't have to be a really, a current example for you, but something that you've either been involved with, or you know about, or maybe you're a customer of an organization that you think is high performing. What's an example of the kinds of behaviors that you see high performing organizations do?
The ability to pivot quickly, adaptability.
Adaptability. Okay, so you would see that in an organization.
Yeah,
When
things aren't working out, they know how to.
Oh. Okay. Yeah. So they learn basically. You're saying they learn to be able to shift or whatever.
Innovative.
Being innovative. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So think about Apple Computer over the years, right? Would you think that they were high performing? Do they now whether or not they abide, all of the core values? I'm not sure, but some of them perhaps. And then you see the list here in the next slide. But yeah, that's part of innovative. Sean?
Exceptional customer service.
Yeah. Exceptional customer service.
Exceeding customer expectations.
Exceeding customer expectations. Yeah. How many? I've been involved with Sterling since 1994. Okay, and it's a curse and a blessing. My wife hates when I go into a restaurant with her and I say, "Oh, that process is all screwed up," and I start talking about, "Oh, they don't care about the customer." I start talking to her in quality terms, and I got to remember not to say all that stuff with my wife around or anybody else at the table. So if you're going out to dinner with a bunch of you that's all you talk about. I've done that many times, so it's something to think about. Yeah, so there are high performance. You kind of see it when you know it, or I should say, you know it when you see it. But that's not entirely true. You really have to dig a little bit deeper than that. So these are the 11 criteria. I'm sorry, the 11 core values. Sterling core values, same as Baldrige. And you can see the reference that I put on this page as well. You can take them much more in depth. I'm not going to talk about all of these things, but I mentioned Apple. Visionary leadership is probably a core value of Apple, or at least Steve Jobs when he created the company and as he ran it. Visionary leadership is probably existent in Apple. Where visionary leadership really is intended to keep focus on future goal, future targets, and be able to sell that, but really to be able to get people to buy in, to be engaged and understand, and all be working towards the same goals. That's what visionary leadership is in a nutshell. But you can see all the other things how those things are important in every organization as it operates. So systems perspective is another one of those. Like I said, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but we think about we want to contrast what is systems perspective, as compared to silo thinking or functional or departmental thinking, isolated. Not that these are bad, but they're not as good as what we're going to see in the other list. You've got incremental improvements, data collection. That's good, right? Being able to collect data. I mean, individual heroes or stars. Probably reactive is the worst one on this list. You don't want to be totally reactive. But there's individual cooperation and process alignment. That's not a bad thing, right? Alignment. But when you think about, looking at the systems thinking point of view, instead of incremental improvement, you're looking at, breakthrough innovation, kind of higher level continuous improvement. Not just your everyday run-of-the-mill continuous improvement, but higher level. Data aggregation as opposed to data collection. We might collect customer survey data, let's say. So we have customer survey data, and that's good. But there's a lot of other stuff out there about our customers. Out in Google, in the analytics or other social media. Just our own sales force might be out there talking to customers and collecting information. We've got not just customer survey data anymore, but we've got all this other stuff. And being a systems thinker, you got to think about all of that stuff and try and analyze all of that together to figure out what it is that we're doing right or we're not doing right for our customers. So when we talk about evaluating and assessing an organization, we're looking at the approaches or the processes, and the categories of the criteria 1 through 6 are what we call the process categories. And then we've got to understand results too, which is the category 7 of the Sterling. We've got to understand, how effective our processes and our approaches to give us the results that we need, that we're looking for. When we're actually looking at those things, we're asking questions, when we do an assessment with an organization, we're asking the questions to try to understand about the company. We're thinking about several things. We're thinking about the key business factors, as I mentioned earlier. That comes from the organizational profile. What's important to the organization? Is it important for us to ask questions about the process they have for conserving paper towels in the restroom? Well, most likely not. but it might be important to some particular type of organization. I doubt it, but it might be. And so we've got to figure out, what's really important. We're talking about a hospital. What are some of the really important things that we should hear about? When we talk to the organization, we should hear about infection rates, right? Unintentional infection rates, perhaps deaths or other kind of, errors, medical errors that we might make. Those kinds of things should be, described in some way or related in some way to the organizational profile, so that we see that as an important key factor in the organization. If you're a prison or police organization, sheriff or county, one of the things that's very important is the recidivism rate, right? How easily do our inmates, when they're released, go back into a life of crime? So that's important. I mean, and if you go to a lot of police organizations today, they'll actually measure it. They'll have some kind of measure about that because it is important to them. That's a key business factor. We have to look at the maturity of the process in the system, and we'll talk about that here in a few more slides, what that means. How mature is that process? Is it good enough to say, I just have a process? Is it good enough to say, well, we have a process and we use it, here in this part of the organization? Or, is it good enough to say we have a process that we're learning from, that we've made improvements to? We'll talk about all that in just a couple more minutes. But then when we talk about metrics, measures, results, we've got to understand also what level are we at, and do we have comparisons to tell us how good is good? We might have customer surveys left and right that tell us we're 96% customer satisfaction. It sounds great, right? 96%. But the whole rest of the world is at 97. Okay. So 96 is all of a sudden it's not that good. And we've got to know that. We've got to have those comparisons to be able to judge the goodness level of the results that we have. When we talk about key processes, if you do have a key process out there, if you've got a training process, let's say, or production, let's talk about production. You got a production process. Well, now we've got to look at, what would be a relevant performance measure for that production process. We've got to know, is it related to our mission? Mission can give it relevance. Is it a key process? So obviously, in a manufacturing company, the production process is a key process. But there are a lot of other kinds of processes in all kinds of organizations that might not obviously be a key process for that organization until you really start to delve in and take a look. Is it related to the key factors? Whatever the process it is, does it really relate to something that we said or that they said in their organizational profile was important to the company? And comparative performance, as I just said, do we have comparative? You can't compare everything in an organization. You've got too many processes, and the biggest problem with comparisons is, it's not the problem with comparisons, it's how do you get those comparisons? Many companies that I've worked with, that I've assessed, are very narrow focused. They think the only way they can get comparisons is by getting it from their competitors, which is really hard to get. If you ever try to get data out of your competitor, good luck. It's not something that's going to happen very easily. So what do? What would you do? If you can't get the data from competitors, what do? Where do you look for comparison? How could you look for comparison?
Trade journals.
Trade journals, yeah, maybe from industry. Might be some industry standards out there, perhaps. That's one way you could look at it. What else do you think you could do? Well, you look at analogous processes. Just because my company's a manufacturing company doesn't mean that my HR processes can't be compared to HR processes for another company, manufacturing or not, that doesn't compete with me. So it's much easier for me to go to a non-competitor, especially outside my industry, to get, to get some comparisons. I call them analogous. They may have analogous process. So you have to understand what the differences are between your process and the comparison process, but you can use that information. I had a Motorola. You heard Bob talking about Motorola. They were a client of mine back in the early 2000s. They were applying for the Sterling Award, and they used to at the plantation facility. One of the other things they did there was they made most of you probably don't remember, but they had those press-to-talk cell phones. I don't know if you remember those. They're like two-way radios, but they were cell phones as well. Nextel was a big name in that market. But they would, what they used to do was they could build. You could order it today. They would build your phone, your press-to-talk, push-to-talk phone. When you order, you give them all the data that you want loaded into the phone, and they would build it today and it would ship tomorrow. So they could do that in like less than a day. And that was really, big stuff. But they couldn't compare it to anybody, they said. We can't compare this to anybody. Nobody else does what we do. Okay, so they didn't win the award the first year. The second year, what we did was we continued to look for comparisons that were analogous. And back then, like 2003 or 4, Dell Computer was world class. They were able to do almost the same thing with the computer within 3 days. So that was one of the comparisons that Motorola used, was that 3-day comparison of computers from Dell to their 1-day comparison of cell phones. And actually that year, that's not the only reason why, but they actually won the Sterling Award that year when they went back to it. That's the kind of things that we got to look for. This is another key balance. It's another key part of evaluation. I can't tell you how many companies I go to, especially in small manufacturers, and what do they measure? Financials, right? Everybody measures financials. They measure, maybe sales, maybe revenues, maybe margin, but they measure those high-level financials and nothing else. Everything else is gut feel. Everything else is intuitive, and that just doesn't get. That's not going to help you. I had a client one time, speaking of workforce measures. I asked him a question about how do you gauge engagement? How do you judge engagement of your workforce? And the CEO says, "Oh, that's easy." He says, "I go out there every day on the floor, and if I see Maria in her station smiling, I know everything is great." True story. And so I said, "Well, Maria's not there that day, and how does Maria know what, Jack over in that other corner of the factory is thinking, or whatever?" And so they didn't have any answers for that question. But so you've got to have the data. I mean, it's got to be data-based, fact-based kind of decision making, and you've got to have that balance. Has anybody ever heard of the balanced scorecard? Yeah. Well, balanced scorecard basically talks about customers, resources, workforce, learning, resources and development, financials and strategic, and process. Process is another word. Process is it? Okay. So you can see it. So process. All those things are important to balance look at a company and how a company performs and what level of high performance it actually is attained. And then the business model. If you've got an in-house versus an outsourced, if I'm a manufacturer that assembles, strictly just assembles, I buy parts from everybody else and I put it all together, versus I'm actually making my own parts, putting it together. I'm just bringing in raw materials, so obviously in the one that I'm doing the assembly and outsourcing all of my components, supply chain is very important to me, and so I need to have measures that reflect that supply chain. Whereas it's not quite as important. It's still important, but raw material is a little bit easier than tolerance on component parts that are being produced, and so so that's going to be different, for me if I'm being assessed, if I'm that company, the outsourcing company, or if I'm the actual production type of company. Okay, you cannot read that, and you're not intended to read that, but in the guide on page 55, you see, I just wanted to see what this looks like kind of at a high level. It's you can see in this left column, there are a bunch of numbers, and it goes goes from 0% to 100% down here. And then this description, this is just what there's 4 bullets in every one. We're going to get a closer look in a second. But each one of those, is a description of the company in a certain aspect, certain dimension, and I'm going to talk about that. So as I'm exploring, this would be, and it's identical, you'll see again for the result piece, it's identical to, not identical, it's just an identical format to the results scoring. This is the process scoring, the other will be the result. But as I'm scoring, I'm looking for what's the best fit, which description best fits the organization that I'm assessing right now. And so I'm looking at all these bullet points here. And to just get a little closer look at that middle section, you can see it's a 50 to 65% range, and there are 4 bullet statements. I'm not going to read all this, but effective, systematic approach, responsive to the overall questions of the items, evident, and so on. So there's 4 descriptors like that, and I want you to take note. At the end of each line is this letter, A, D, L, I, and in every one of those levels, same thing. You get 4 descriptors, A, D, L, I, and I'll talk about what A, D, L, I means and how it fits into the scoring here in just a couple more slides. So when you look at that format, the scores, basically at a high level, that's really what this is saying. So if I'm looking for process, if I'm doing the process categories 1 through 6, a 0 or a 5%, there's no process. Nothing's going on. And if there's no process, it doesn't really matter. Anything else doesn't really matter. There may be some beginning processes. It might be systematic, but it's still in the lower end, maybe early. It could be solidly systematic, you get higher and higher scores. Fully systematic, or it could be like a role model, process, role model organization. So I told you, remember the A, D, L, and I, and here they are again. ADLI. Everybody's got their acronyms, right? So the Sterling acronym ADLI. It's really evaluating the maturity of the process, maturity of the approaches, maturity of the system overall. And when you're talking about A, that means the approach. Is there an approach? Is it systematic? Is it measurable? Is it repeatable? That's the threshold. If you don't have an approach, you might as well, not go anywhere else. You have to have an approach in order to look at the rest to really be able to score. If there's no approach, the score is down in the 0 range. But then you've got D, L, and I, deployment, learning, and integration. And those are independent of one another. They're not, the order is not important. You can have an approach, no deployment, or very low deployment, but you might still have learning coming from that approach. And so on. So when you talk about deployment means, is that approach being used appropriately in all the places that it should be used? I'll go back to a customer survey example. If I'm using a customer survey process, I'm using it with my customers, right? Am I using it with all my customers? So there's a lot of questions. Okay, are we learning and improving the process and building training off of the learnings that we have so that our workforce is better at using that process? I wouldn't think that deployment doesn't matter if I'm taking that customer service process and asking my employees, because it just wouldn't make sense. It might be a separate process for employees, but it's not the same customer service process that I'm using. So deployment doesn't mean everywhere. It just means everywhere that's appropriate and that it should be used, it's being used. Then we talk about learning, you're talking about the knowledge. And there's really 3 levels of learning. You've got the individual level, which comes from training or experience in the job. You have process level learning, which, again, to use the same customer survey example, if I'm learning from my customer survey process that I'm only getting 2% response rate, how can I fix that so that I'm getting higher response rate of my process? That's process level. And then there's the organizational level learning, which looks at, okay, customer service process, the process is working pretty good. I'm getting some information. Now, that information is going to help me with other processes. That information is going to help me with my product, quality perhaps, or, some other processes within my organization. That's where I get the organizational level learning. And that's what we want to see. And we want to be able to embed that. As I mentioned earlier, you want it to stay when people go. The people who have that learning, you want it to stay. And it might be, you might do a Kaizen with people who are knowledgeable about the process, their knowledge gets into, the design of a new process, perhaps, and now that new process is here to stay, even if those people, retire or go on vacation or go away. And then integration, we talked about that a little bit earlier in the model. It's that middle word in the model that, really is that harmonization of the plans and the processes, and everything is tied together and aligned with our strategies. Okay, so here's this first line up here, which says 5.2C1. That's the criteria question. Okay, how does the workforce performance management system support high performance? Just read through this. Just take a minute or so. Just kind of read through it and see if you see any hints in there of approach. Is there an approach or a hint of an approach? This is not the entire response. This is from a real application, but the response went a lot longer than this. But this is like the first paragraph of the response. So take a look. Do you see any hints of approach? Do you see any hints of deployment, hints of learning, hints of integration? Just take a minute and read it. Can you all read that back there? And you can all read it online, I suppose. You see any approaches? Do you see any bits and pieces of a process in there, maybe? Yeah, probably a little bit. Again, it's not a complete approach. Okay, that's not the complete answer. But you see a little bit of that. Is there any, let's see, is there any deployment in there? Yeah, very little, I would say. Very little deployment. Learning, do you see any learning comes out of that?
What would you say qualifies as deployment?
Well, if they talk about their process and how it's trained so the workforce knows how to use that process properly, that's part of deployment. In this case, so this is a workforce question. Is it used across the workforce? I've been in companies where they have a workforce performance management system, but they do it on the production floor. They don't worry about people in the offices. That's a lack of deployment. The next question is the next slide is another one. I'm not going to ask you to go through this, but I just wanted to point out a couple things. Here you see in the description they talk about, well, the first step is blah 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 blah. The next step is blah 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 blah. So you can see there's a hint of an approach there. Something that's going on. Here's a bit of deployment and learning, actually, both. When these teams are created, we need to test and create exercises to prepare our teams for business continuity. So you can see it's being used that way. And then integration, you organize operational financial impacts worksheet. Because even though the criteria here is how do you ensure organizations can anticipate recover from disasters, well, financial is kind of an integration piece, right? And we're not talking. The question doesn't ask about financials at all, but it's part of that integration. They're talking about what's important to the company in there. So you can see a little bit of all that. That's kind of what we look at when we're looking at the criteria and the responses to the criteria.
Question?
Yes.
Are they aware of the criteria when they're answering those questions?
Yes, the question is, are the companies aware of the criteria that they're answering? And yes, they have in that book. There's the criteria for the Sterling Award, and the Oglethorpe is the same, identical as I said. There's also criteria in there for something called challenge. There's also the manufacturing, piece, the Sterling Manufacturing Business Excellence Award, which is not quite at the high level of Sterling Award and Oglethorpe, but it's another criteria derived from the full set of criteria. So in results, as I told you, the similar format. Okay, you've got scoring down here, and then you've got descriptors, and on the you can see the resource, the reference. On the next slide, if you look at that middle band, again, same scoring range, and it's got the descriptors. There's 4 descriptors here. And notice here, you'll see LE for level, P for trend, C for comparison, and I for integration. So this is something the acronym is called LETC, and I'll show you in more detail in 2 more slides. But it does the same thing. It describes the organization, and the examiner's job is to see which description fits best. A simplified version of what the results scoring, what the results sheet says. Here it's really not database. It's the low score, 0 to 5. It's not database. Very intuitive. very gut feel kind of operations or kind of results. And then, a few results, when you get to this level here, the 30 to 45, that's where you start to see a little bit, a company wouldn't score there unless there's a little bit of comparison going on, a little bit of attempt, to get some comparative information. And then, much better user results, as you continue to score higher, is much more of everything. And then in the Let's See levels, there's got to be some level. Like when I said 96%, yes. Karen, let's hear from you.
Oh, Phil, I've been writing comments this entire time. But what's really amazing about the results portion is, sometimes these organizations, they write such beautiful comments, and I just think, wow, that is a best practice. But then we get to the results, and if they don't look good, is that approach actually effective?
Yeah.
Example of looks good on paper.
Yeah, exactly. Like it sounds really good, but does it really work?
Okay. Any questions on the Let's See approach? Yes.
On Kara's comment, historically, when the Baldrige was first put together, the focus was on process. Making sure that you followed the prescribed process, right? They didn't say exactly how to do it, but that you're reading the process part. And they really didn't put very much emphasis on results. So a first few Baldrige award winners actually went out of business. So, time to reconsider these things, right? And then eventually it went from a little bit more results to 50-50 results. Now the pendulum is swinging, I think, too far to the results side. In the Baldrige, the awards now are going to be issued based on results. Okay, and they're not really looking at the process that much. So, Carol, what you were saying, that this process should provide these results, they're saying the reverse. They're saying for you to have consistent results over time with trends, with good comparisons, with good sustainability and all those things, in order for you to do that, in my opinion, you could be lucky, okay? But most likely it's because you had a good process.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's what they're trying to say. I'm agreeing, by the way, I think there should be both, but I'm just trying to explain to you how it
and that's right. What Rick you said about the Baldrige, kind of modifying their approach a little bit. It hasn't happened, and probably not going to happen with the Sterling to that extent at all, because as I said earlier, the Sterling is more developmental, and if you're just looking at results, it's very difficult to develop based on just results, right? You got to have the process, like you said, and so that's going to continue with the Sterling framework as it has been. It might be streamlined a little bit, but it's still important to see what are you doing, and how are you doing it? Are you learning from it in order to be able to say, okay, now what are the results for that? Are you getting results that match the process?
It's almost like being in the stock market, right? And waiting for the quarterly results.
Yeah, and not
no process.
You don't know what they did. How much debt they went into and stuff. Yeah, you don't know the process coming back. Okay. And so here's an example of a result. Okay, it's figure 7.3835. Again, from a real application. It's been sanitized. There were a couple places where the company name was visible. But this is the criteria that it can't change. And notice it says, what are your workforce engagement results? On the process categories, the questions are, how do you do this? How do you manage? How do you build and manage your performance management system? It's how. So when how is asking about process, the why, just why. What is it? What's your result for doing that? And this is just one piece of a lot of answers that this company gave, yeah, from a real company. And this is the associate engagement based on user service. It's kind of weak, by itself. It's absolutely useless. But you can't really tell. There's some coloration in there, but what they, when you talk about, let's see, well, they have levels. These are 90 something, 80 something, 5 to 10 years, and so they've got some levels, right? Trends, they don't really talk about trends here. There's a caveat to that, though. Comparisons, yeah, they have a comparison. They're comparing to the internal average performance. Internal average performance, and you can't see the colors on this for some reason, but some of these are green, some of these are on orange. So green means it's better than the average performance. The orange means worse than the average performance, but that's not really comparison. That's a trend. That tells me a trend, and it doesn't tell me it's comparison at all. So an internal average is really not to be considered a comparison. They might be to the industry average. And even industry average is a low-level comparison because it doesn't tell anything about best in class or world class. It doesn't say anything about the industry standard. It doesn't say anything about that. So it's got little arrows as good as up, but I mean it's not really a chart. So what does good mean? Higher is what they mean by that. But so that's not really a great response for this particular category, this particular criteria, one piece of criteria. Okay. So just to summarize all that, and there's still more I'm going to talk about on the next slide for a second on something a little bit different. But the framework is based on the core value concepts. That's kind of a summary thing. The core values are there, and the criteria are there to help determine how deeply embedded those core values are in the organization, which are the characteristics of high-performing organizations. And then you assess by using those scoring guidelines or descriptors. You're using the scoring dimensions for process ADVI, for results let's see, and you're kind of putting all that together and seeing the this multi-perspective, and that's really the strength of the whole thing. And then the next slide, I think this is the last one. So being examined or being an examiner. When you're examined, there are multiple kinds of assessments. I think this is one of the questions that came up before we started this. There are a lot of different kinds of assessments that are available. You've got the award assessments, obviously, the Governor Sterling Award and the Georgia Oglethorpe Award. You've got the Manufacturing Business Excellence Award, which kind of crosses between consultation and competition in a way. But you have those multiple kinds of assessments. And then there are others which are facilitated assessments. So, a team of master examiners might show up at the door if you want them there. And, it's not like trick or treat. They'll come to and they'll meet with you and your senior leaders, and they'll go through, they'll facilitate your answering of the questions, the criteria questions. And it's kind of like real-time feedback on what you're doing, what you're not doing, and how you can improve. So there's those kinds of assessments as well that be going on. But it really looks at how well leadership, management, measurement, operation systems address strategic challenges. Prepares the organization for enduring success. That's what an evaluation does for you. It really does open your eyes. I've had, specifically with the Sterling Manufacturing Business Excellence Award, that's one of the awards that I coordinate the entire staff. It's just starting up right now. And one of the things that I see is, a lot of times the manufacturers, especially the smaller ones, will come in thinking that this whole thing is just a popularity contest and it's there for a marketing award. Usually the first time they get involved, the person that they send to be the point of contact is the marketing director or sometimes the public relations person. And, they'll tell us about all the Chamber of Commerce awards and, best product on the market award and all these kinds of things. And none of those awards are based on the merit of performance. None of it. And so when they see what we're doing, the kinds of questions we ask, suddenly they, and that the one company I'm thinking of, the marketing guy was the first guy that I met. And he was one of my point of contact until the end, when the room was full of the senior people, the CEO and the CFO, and everybody was in there to listen and hear the feedback that we gave them about what they did or what they didn't do, and what they could do better. But that's really is a good way to engage the workforce and the leadership.
To be an examiner is quite rewarding. Just through the process, you learn exactly what the performance excellence system is and how that's applied in organizations. We joke as examiners that we steal best practices. Well, it's not stealing, but you get exposed to amazing things that these companies, these organizations are doing. And you can take that, you can learn how they did it, you can ask all these questions about how they did it and how they matured into it, and then bring it back to your own organization. I mean, that alone is incredible. You get to go inside and ask all these amazing questions. You also get to refine your leadership skills. So as an examiner, we looked at those 7 categories. You get to become a category lead on one of those. You take ownership of it. And that's just incredible. So let's say you're looking to get more experience with operations. You can learn all of the criteria in operations and become essentially the subject matter expert talking to everyone. And this is everyone from the C-suite. You're talking to the chief operating officer all the way down to the frontline person. And in healthcare, that could be a nurse. It could be a doctor's technically frontline. It could even be the janitor asking them what they do. You're talking to everyone just to see if everything lines up. Of course, also enhance your understanding of the application of all the various things we talked about in those triads and how they're integrated. We talked about it. So, if you're focused on operations and you're doing all this agile and incredible stuff, how is that affecting your workforce? Are they getting burnt out? Well, guess what? You can see and learn from the people who've already done it. You're getting that inside look. My absolute favorite part about it, though, is being part of the community. When we're in these examiner meetings, I feel like I am home with fellow process improvement people. All we care about is performance excellence. We're all on the same page. And at the end of it, we get to have this huge black tie party, with amazing food and live entertainment where we just get to celebrate that we went through it and to celebrate the award winners. So, I mean, that's part of being an examiner. Oh, and Phil, I just put this in the chat. If you're an ASQ 15 member, we actually offer a scholarship if you want to become an examiner. It's called our Member Value Award. And all you have to do is be an active member in ASQ 1510, whether that's the student branch or in our actual, professional membership. So take it away, Phil.
Okay, thanks, Kara. Yeah, it's really an eye-opening experience, like Kara said. I feel like you may have heard, some of you may have heard me say this before, but I feel like I've done this now for 30 years. Probably 500 companies. I feel like I've earned multiple master's degrees in organizational behavior and organizational development and all that. I just see so much, and you see what works, you see what doesn't work, and it's really is amazing. I mentioned that the Sterling Manufacturing is an excellent award cycle is starting now. The way we do that, we start with nominations from the community. So we're soliciting, some of you may have already seen my emails. Soliciting, if you know a manufacturer, anybody can nominate a manufacturer, and you don't have to write them up. All we need is contact information, and we take it from there. But anyway, so we're doing that right now. Nominations are open until December 20th. So we're looking for manufacturers across Florida and Georgia. We got a bunch already that have been nominated. And then the Sterling Overstore process begins in August next year again. It started this year. So they're, in fact, today and tomorrow and Thursday is the last training session for exams, all virtual. All the training is done virtually. They've had 2 other sessions in the past 2 weeks. And, so the examiners go through that process. They get what they call deconflicted, and assigned to a team for one of the companies, one of the organizations that is applying for the award, whether it's in Florida or Georgia, it doesn't matter. It's still the same team of examiners. And again, we have a team of examiners in the Sterling Manufacturing Awards process as well. And that team is a mix of Sterling trained examiners and people who are from the manufacturing community, whether they're actually in manufacturing companies or they're from the state colleges, in manufacturing programs, or they're from the Career Source and Economic Development, organizations, or some of them are actually from, large, like insurance companies that deal with manufacturers. Nothing gets sold while we're doing our evaluation. So those people bring their experience. They don't bring their sales role with them. We're there to do that evaluation. It's not a popularity contest. None of those are popularity contests. They're really based on performance. So it has to be, has to be earned for real. Like I said, I think that's the last. Yeah. Do you have any questions? This, by the way, the 33rd annual conference, Sterling Conference at the end of May. It's Memorial Day week at the Hyatt Regency in Orlando. If you want more information, there's a couple of websites you can check out. Contact Tara or me about anything that you want to know. Steve.
I just want to give a shout out. I thought the examiner training, I've been through the process only one time, but I was so impressed with the training that Sterling provided as an examiner. It was hugely thorough. I mean, it was hard. It was comprehensive, but you learn because you want to hit the ground running. That said, you're not going to be hitting the ground unprepared because you're teamed up with people with experience. And that's wonderful because you'll be working in these things, being a value add to your team, the other examiners, but then you have people with experience that you'll learn from as you go. So it was a wonderful group to work with. So all of my colleagues, there are like 8 of us, I guess, total on our team, were just wonderful people to work with. And then you have like a team lead for all of us. You would have leads within each of the 6 areas, and then you would also have an overall lead for, let's say, the team. Wonderful support. Okay, very good stuff. I think the tool that we used that year to collect our data and do that was one of the first times, and that worked out surprisingly well.
Yeah.
So that was post-transition to that new system, and so that's a good thing. But,
And that's been improved over the years.
yeah,
too.
I thought it was great. So I mean, I spent a good 200 hours dedicated to the process, and it's all donated time.
Yeah, from August until
early
April.
The training time
spread
is
out.
time. And then when you actually get into the assessment, it's like a week, all day long each day. You're going to have like back-to-back meetings, but it's great. It's all, you don't waste any time. And then you have to go through, after you have your meeting, virtual in our case, then you have to put all this stuff together and say, now what does it mean and what's going to be the consensus? So all that consensus work, it's really, really constructive work. So I think it's great for people. I think it's a great ad for firms that have process improvement processes in place or teams that they should consider a Sterling assessment to be part of their bag of tricks that they do for the organization. Lead that. I think that would be awesome. It's a huge value add, and it's important because I think one of the weaknesses of PI programs is the potential for them not to be a bottom line accountable. And therefore they're nice to have. And if you're nice to have, then all of a sudden it's easy for you to get like walked out. So I just think it's a great addition. I thought when Baldrige came out in like the 90s, I thought it was very inspiring because it was literally comprehensive. It was new. A lot of companies adopted the company as I was at the time, Westinghouse. Created their own, they called it George Westinghouse Total Quality Work. It mimicked Baldrige, but that in itself, taking that type of view of assessment of the firm, I think is really good if you champion it. So if the firm's behind it, and I mean the whole firm, including especially the leadership, and what you're getting back for cheap is all these OFEs. Did you mention? I could hear parts, but
no, I never actually said the word OFE.
Yeah, firms don't want to know what they do well as much as they want to know where there are opportunities to improve, because you're having experts come in here and assess your place and say, these are things you could do even better.
Yeah.
So I just think the whole thing was it was surprisingly good. Sometimes like, yeah, okay, I'll try it. And you get it and you go, wow, this was really good. So, I applaud Kara's commitment to this because it's a huge commitment. Of course, Phil's like embedded in this, which is great, but he shows leadership for our organization, but also for the region. And he also gets out there to the companies and all that. So that's wonderful too. But I think this is like a hidden gem because I don't know that many people that know about it. I don't know about industries, how much industries know, but I think as far as internal consulting and the ability to use this in your own firm, I think it's great.
Yeah, I had first it is a lot of work, in any one year, because even if you're a veteran examiner, you still go through training every year. Not the first introductory days, but for the bulk of the training. And it's, but I was a master examiner for 17 years, and I always tell a story. Every year I said, I'm never doing this again. But I said that for 17 years because it truly was a very valuable experience. Really opened my, like I said, it's master's degree type of experience you gain from this. And but I had another client, to your point about bringing that expertise in house in an organization. You don't even have to actually apply for the award, but using it as your bag of tools, your box of tools. I had a client here in Miami actually, and or there in Miami, and they were using the process. They would send people through training every year. They would send a few more people, so they eventually, got the bulk. And they started with their board of directors. And every year they would write their own application, and then they would hire some independent consultants like me, and me and two other people or three others, and we'd be independent, totally independent. But we would evaluate their application, which was really a response to all the criteria, and I would give them feedback and strengths and opportunities that we saw, and just as the other consultants did too. And they did that every year. Then they would take the feedback from that, and they would put it into their strategic planning process and improvement process for the next year. And they would do it again. They did that for like 7 years in a row. And then on the 8th year, they decided, well, let's apply for it. So they actually wrote the application like they normally did, but then they actually submitted it. And they won because they were very, very good. They had been, very intentional in making improvement year after year after year, and based on the criteria and the framework, and really growing as an organization. So, okay, any other, yes?
Yeah, I just have a general question. What are I recognize some of the names of some of the winners in the two categories, but what are the head count of the
Good question.
companies that you see when they get to that kind of point of critical mass to be able to?
The smallest company that I'm aware of that did an evaluation for the Sterling evaluation was a 17-person company. And then, on up to, Lockheed Martin facility or, Allied Signal facility, big companies, but everything in between. And so you don't have to be a big company. What's a point to make though about big versus small is that your organization profile is different, right? Just based on that fact that you get different numbers of employees, but the high performing approach for a small company is probably not a high performing same approach, probably not a high performing for the larger company. So there's that kind of stuff going on, and stuff that you're thinking about when you're evaluating. So, Jim,
I was going to say, were you primarily dealing with manufacturing companies or all?
No, for the Sterling, all kinds. For the manufacturing business excellence, just manufacturing, obviously, but for with the Sterling and the Oglethorpe, it's across the board. Government, like I say, government healthcare, other not-for-profits, other for-profits, all the way, the whole spectrum. And Rick?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you're at that point, but remember I asked you about the organization, how it's nonprofit, public, private funding, and so forth. Do you have any idea on that?
For the Sterling. Oh yeah, right. Okay, so Sterling it's a not-for-profit. It was originated in the governor's office back in 1992. Governor Childs. Most of you don't remember that name. Some of you do. But Governor Childs started it off. In fact, he hired the first director, John Piano, who's a retired Navy captain. So he's the one who created that, and they continue to be not-for-profit today. the governor support has waned, I would say. You dropped to a plateau, low level plateau since Jeb Bush, probably back in the early 2000s. It's got kind of just flattened out. So there's not a whole lot of support, the active support that's coming from them. They still support it, on paper and in letters and things like that. But there is a Sterling Foundation, which is separate, and it is a not-for-profit, charitable organization that does take donations, and they use that funding for IT, information systems type of support for Sterling. Like right now they're getting rid of an old Lotus system and moving into more the Microsoft Outlook kind of thing. So that's what the foundation really pays for. It doesn't, it's not a big foundation. I think it's got I don't know, $110,000 as a reserve, that kind of thing. It's pretty small. That foundation's go. Does that answer what you're asking for? What else do you want to know about that? And there's a fee, to apply for the award. There's a fee, and the bigger the company, the higher the fee. But even then, the most expensive is probably, I don't have to look exactly, but it's probably in the $16,000 range for the whole process. The whole process from the application, and it might be a little less now because they used to also, out of that money, they would also pay for the travel for the examiner team when they went to do a site visit. But now that's all done virtually, so there's no cost in that way. So it's a benefit to the companies that are involved. Can I see another hand? Okay. Any last things online?
Hey, Phil, is the number of applicants leveled off? Is it getting higher, lower? What's the trend?
It's been up and down, especially with COVID. We thought that applicants would drop off completely, and they didn't. They still, were in place. But in any one year, I think last year we had 7. The year before we probably had 6. This year I don't know how many yet. They haven't been presented to the judges team yet. But I think during COVID one year there were 3. One of the issues that Baldrige and Sterling both deal with is the lack of manufacturing participation. And that's one of the reasons why we created the manufacturing award, to put focus on manufacturing, because manufacturing is extremely important for our economy. It's more stable. In the downturns, it doesn't go down as far, and it comes back sooner than the rest of the, than tourism, something like that.
There's less manufacturing. We got to bring it back from China.
Well, in Florida, it's actually growing. In Florida, it's growing. It's been growing since the Great Recession in 2007. The GDP for manufacturing in Florida has gone from like 4.7 to now it's about 5.2 or 5.3%, which is a lot in GDP when you compare it to tourism and agriculture. I want to thank everybody for attending, and thank you, Kara.
Perfect. Phil, if you just want to hang out, we got 2 more questions in the chat. So I'll read them aloud. We have a question. What mindset and cultural approach are essential for companies aiming to apply for the Baldrige Award? And how does this mindset influence their commitment to continuous improvement and excellence?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. So when I see companies that really want to be involved, they pay a fee for this, so it's not free for them to get involved. They really are looking for improvement opportunities. They really want to know what they can do better, and we see that especially in the companies that are participating in more than one year. When they come back, we see the improvements that they've made based on the feedback that we gave them. So that's a really good thing. But they have to have that open-mindedness, and at least a little bit of the workforce engagement attitude. My own, and I don't have any data on this, and I don't have any comparative data, but my own estimation is that there's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10% of leaders of organizations that are truly interested in finding ways to improve, and and they're, you know, no-brainers for going into sterling or something like that. They but the rest are more of a hard sell. You know, there are many leaders out there that are more of a hard sell in you know, opening up their doors to participate in an assessment like this.
Thank you. And we have a second question from someone who seems to know the language pretty well. So dating back to 1990, we're going way back. How has both the Baldrige and the Sterling Award evolved over the years to prevent situations where award-winning companies like Wallace Co. in 1990 struggle with profitability despite recognition for quality?
Yeah, that's some of the improvement that's happened within the both frameworks, you know, over the years. There was Baldrige did have in the 90s, they created an index, an S&P index actually, and I couldn't tell you exactly how they measured it, but they would take the company or a company that was participating in you know, or division, let's say, of a company that was on the stock market, and they would you know, they would measure what was going on, and that worked really well. It showed that the companies that were involved, or they had a division involved, you know, were better than their competitors. But all that went out the window when the dot-com implosion happened, like in 1998, 99, 2000. It just threw it off completely. And some companies continued to do well, but some didn't. And, you know, so, you know, they've looked at, you know, the criteria are not quite as complicated as it used to be back in 1990, you know, 1990 to 1988. It's been streamlined a lot since then. And, you know, but there is no, unfortunately, there's no S&P, you know, index anymore to be able to use like that to see if it's actually working and helping.
Oh, but that also brings up a good point. I've only been doing this for 3 years, and it's apparent that some organizations, you know, where do they get their funding from? If they're a government organization and their funding gets cut, you know, who are you talking about profitability?
Yeah, they have to be resilient, they have to be agile and all that, and be able to show that they can adapt.
Yeah, but that's the last of the questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Kara.